Well, Stanley Park is a beautiful place to go for a walk on a hot, sunny day. Its traditional Indigenous name is Kwai, and there are many stories from the park that most of us don't even know. Well, our next guest shares that history with a walking tour that you can go on now. Will Woods is the founder and chief storyteller of Forbidden Vancouver. Will, hello there.
Hello, Gloria. How are you doing?
I am doing well, thank you. I hope you're having a good summer so far. This is so interesting. I know you have uncovered so many stories about Stanley Park already. So let's start with, how did it come to be in the first place?
Well, I get that question quite a lot from people about, how did this tour come about? And it's been going for about 4 or 5 years. We already had a number of other walking tours we've been doing for longer than that. And I'd actually thought for a while that Stanley Park always fascinated me because I had this sort of burning question of like, why is there this giant park here? Like we have, it's right by downtown, and what were the decisions made that led to this huge park being established? And it seemed quite strange to me that we had such a large park right on the edge of downtown, and that was probably prompted in some part. It was part of my, like many people, I'd go for a jog every week in Stanley Park and ruminate to myself on that. And I guess that intersected with wanting to have a walking tour in which we shared some of the stories of some of the incredible Indigenous people that we have locally or have been alive, in the past. And often our walking tours, might be in Gastown. We talk more about settlers, for example, and we thought, well, maybe Stanley Park's the perfect place to share some more of those Indigenous stories that from people who lived in the park or who lived nearby or had some connection to it.
Well, and how was it decided that we have this giant park right next to a big city?
Well, I think there's this kind of myth that we have that Stanley Park is this untouched wilderness that was the city forefathers deemed to turn into a park right around the city's foundation. We've all benefited from it ever since. I guess there's sort of like an element of truth in that, but I think a more accurate representation would be that, and this won't be a surprise, I think, to anyone watching this show, that it really comes down to a giant real estate deal that the Canadian Pacific Railway had as part of bringing the terminus of its railway station to Gastown, where Waterfront Station is today, of course. It had this real estate scheme where it was given or granted huge tracts of land in what would become the West End and Shaughnessy, and they would sell off that land and make themselves a fortune doing it. There was this undeveloped land that was, I suppose, the peninsula of downtown that had been made a military reserve and was owned by the federal government and had been for quite a long time up to this point. And the CPR was worried that the federal government would sell that land to developers, and the value of the CPR's land holdings in the West End and Shaughnessy would go down as a result of this land right on the waterfront, right where Stanley Park is today, would be even more valuable, and they wanted to protect the value of their assets. And of course, having a giant park right next to the West End would only help with West End real estate values anyway. So it just so happened that many CPR officials were on the City of Vancouver Council at that time. They petitioned the federal government and said, well, can we lease this land and make it into a park? And the federal government said, okay. And here we are now, over 130 years later.
There's the overall beauty of the park itself, but then there's all the different areas of the park. The picturesque meeting place like Lumberman's Arch. What used to be there before?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And Lumberman's Arch, that large field there, that was the site of the largest Indigenous village in the park, which I've heard different pronunciations: Woi Woi, Shui Shui, and how it's pronounced. And there were many families living there. And once the park had been, I guess that agreement had been formalized to turn it into a park, City Council quickly moved to evict by force, really, Indigenous people who were living there in a number of different village sites, but certainly Shui Shui was the largest. And the mechanism they used to do this was building the Park Road, which of course is still there today. And the planned route for the Park Road went right through the buildings of this village. And one day the road builders turned up and said to the families living there, hey, you have to go because we're building the road here tomorrow. And so they were forced to leave.
So, what would you say have been the efforts to better reflect Indigenous history in the park, more recently?
There's been a couple of really fantastic, in the last like 10 or 12 years, a couple of really fantastic examples of that. One is the Rose Cole Yelton Memorial Totem at Brockton Point. And many of those totems are from northern BC, but there's a number from local nations now. And in 2009, a carver named Robert Yelton, who was the son of Rose Cole Yelton, worked with a number of other carvers to have that totem carved and placed there on the site that was Rose Cole Yelton's home for many years. And she was actually the last, she didn't live there her entire life, she left, but she was the last person, the last remaining resident, and she died in 2002. That's a really great totem to visit, and there's a plaque there with lots of information about that on there. And the other installation is a fabulous bronze sculpture by an artist called Luke Marston that's also at Brockton Point called Shore to Shore. And it depicts one of the families that made Brockton Point their home. It was a Portuguese man named Portuguese Joe Silvey, and he had two wives. One of them passed away, sadly, and he remarried, and his second wife was also depicted, so the three of them depicted on this bronze statue. And they were called Kwahama and Kultinarts, those two women. And that's well worth a visit. It's a fantastic sculpture. It also has some Portuguese tile work at the base as well. So it really brings together the different influences that made that place home for so many people for so long.
Well, so many stories, Will. And I understand last month you donated 10% of the ticket sales for all of your walking tours to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Why did you feel that was important?
Well, like everyone, we were so disturbed by the finding in Kamloops and the subsequent findings that have happened. And we take our responsibility seriously to try and share histories of Vancouver, the good and the bad, or the some of those histories can be painful to hear. And we don't want to try and hide talking about important histories from our city just because they can be difficult to listen to. And I don't see myself and my guides don't see ourselves as being there to share Indigenous legends or to talk on behalf of Indigenous people. That's absolutely not what we're doing. And there is a walking tour company that does do walks in the park called Talisay Tours, who are Indigenous owned and have Indigenous guides. So we see our role as to talk about some of the incredible Indigenous people that have lived and whose lives have touched Stanley Park, and talk about the histories of what happened to the people in the park. We felt a real responsibility once we heard those stories to try and make a tangible, try and make some sort of contribution to try and help heal some of the pain that the residential school system has caused and continues to cause. And we felt like a financial contribution was the right thing to do, and hopefully does have some benefit.
Well, thank you very much for this window into a little bit of the history of this neck of the woods, literally. Nice to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me.